Good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. So as you know, our task this morning is to formally launch a new report on the school completion programme. We have an interesting set of talks set now for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. So obviously my colleagues Emer Smith, Garan Shingra and Merrica Darmody will take you through the findings. Well, actually, unfortunately, Garan isn't here, but Emer and Merrica will take you through the findings. And we'll also have a policy response from Sheena O'Loughlin from the Department of Education. But before we get to the presentation of the results, I'm delighted to welcome Anya O'Keefe, who's the Director with the Tusla Education Support Services. Tusla commissioned and funded this particular project, so we're very grateful to them for their engagement with the work. I think a lot of you will have seen some of the media coverage already this morning in the papers of the report, so it's an interesting report, and I think a very, very valuable and important report. So Anya, I'm going to call on you if you want to turn on the camera and the microphone, and we look forward to your initial thoughts and reactions.
Thanks so much, Alan. And I am delighted to be here this morning as the Director of TESS, launching this report, the School Completion Programme Revisited. And I suppose at the outset, I note that the report really sets out for us our next work streams in terms of securing further investment and working with the coordinators and the project workers and all of our school colleagues at the front line to respond to some of the recommendations of the report. But I also want to reflect this morning on, I suppose, as you know, school completion, or many of you on the call will know that this was the first area that I worked on in TESS back in 2016, just after the first report had landed. And I suppose school completion, I have a particular role for. I hold it in particularly high regard in terms of the potential and the real impact of the programme as part of the TESS service at Frontline. And I suppose it has been my absolute pleasure in different roles I've held within TESS to work with all of the staff of the programme to deliver on the recommendations that were set out in that 2015 report. That 2015 report became our action plan in TESS, guided by our school completion programme projects, working closely with principals and other school colleagues through the local management committees. And I think that the report has served us so well in terms of what I see coming through in the School Completion Programme Revisited. I'm seeing the significant impact of the work and investment in the programme, the impact of the continuous professional development framework that has been put in place that has enabled frontline project workers, supported by their school completion programme coordinators, to respond to school attendance problems, which, as we all know, have been incredibly challenging in the years, kind of intervening between 2015 and now. We have had, I suppose, what we hope are once-in-a-lifetime events. We have seen school completion, along with TESS colleagues, along with school communities, respond to and be really central to the response, particularly in DEIS communities, to the needs of children, young people, and families and communities throughout and since the COVID-19 pandemic. Furthermore, we've seen that agility that SCP has as a frontline service, planning annually and being able to respond to emerging needs, that agility which has been vital not only in COVID-19 but also in responding to other emerging needs. The needs, for example, of those seeking international protection, fleeing war in Ukraine and other jurisdictions, which has required a rapid and specific response in recent years. So I suppose what I want to reflect today, and what we know today from the report, is that SCP is a key component of the Tusla Education Support Service response to current and emerging school attendance problems. We know that there's been a shift post-pandemic in what some of that looks like, And in our TESS 5-year plan to improve school attendance, which is running from 2003 to 2028, you see school completion positioned there along with other TESS services, educational welfare officers, Home-School-Community-Liaison coordinators, as well as school leadership, all of us coming together to provide responses to our most vulnerable learners. As we know, or as I think is emerging and certainly is clear in our plan, school attendance problems will be best addressed by that integrated response, of which school completion is a key component at front line. So it's a very important time to have this report, coming to us to support our work over the coming years. And I want to thank in particular Emer and Merca Darmody and all the team in the ESRI for their work on this, our Department of Education colleagues, and all of our colleagues across the school completion programme who responded and engaged with the consultations and the development of the report. And then finally, I want to acknowledge the work of Niamh Quinn in leading for TESS on the commissioning and the production of the report. So I suppose I'll hand over to Emer now to take us through those key points today, and just again to reiterate how delighted we are to have this to guide our work for the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. I'm just going to share my screen now, so if you could bear with me while I set it up. Okay. I hope you can all see that.
Yeah, all good, Emer. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Alan. I'm going to present on behalf of my colleagues, Gurrans Hank, who can't be here today because she's in Brazil on holidays, and Merca Darmody. So I'm going to say a little bit about the background to the study, how projects are clustered, how young people and children are referred into school completion supports, the kinds of needs they have, the types of supports they receive, and how they link into other parts of the DEIS suite of supports. Also want to talk a little bit about funding and staffing and the perceived impact of the programme. And we'll finish by saying something about the implications of the study finding for the programme and the broader context within which it's located. Now, I know many of you are working in the area, so bear with me for some basic background for other people. So school completion was established in 2002 to provide support for children and young people at risk of early school leaving. As Anya mentioned, we conducted a review of the programme that was published in 2015. It highlighted the value of the programme, but showed some areas for improvement. And there have been a good deal of changes to the programme subsequently. There has been increased funding and staffing. There's a new intake framework to be used for referral of children and young people. There has been greater emphasis on the use of evidence-based programmes. And there's been new continuous professional development for staff and coordinators, and webinars for members of the local management committees. Now, as Anya has highlighted, we've also seen a change in context. On the one hand, we now have high levels of school retention to leaving cert level in Ireland. But since the pandemic, we've seen increased school absence and disengagement. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So how we did the study is we did a survey of all of the coordinators nationally, and we were really pleased with an 80% response rate because we were aware it was a very long and tough questionnaire. And we used that information to select 6 projects for further in-depth analysis. So we selected them to capture key dimensions of variation in project operation. And within each of those projects, we interviewed the coordinators, the project workers, but also the principals, Home-School-Community-Liaison coordinators, and educational welfare officers that were working with schools in that project. In addition, we did a very large consultation event online in which we fed back emerging findings to coordinators and project workers, and we got some very useful insights into the implications of our findings. So we'd really like to acknowledge the support of Tusla Education Support Service for this, especially Anya O'Keefe and Niamh Quinn, We're really grateful to the school completion coordinators and project workers that were really open with us and very generous with their time. And we're really also very grateful to the school principals, Home-School-Community-Liaison coordinators, and education welfare officers. So just to start by outlining the background and the nature of the programme, it's organised into 121 projects, each of which is managed by a coordinator and overseen by a local management committee. At the moment, it covers 783 primary and post-primary schools that have a total population of over 250,000 students. The core aims and outcomes that the programme seeks to achieve are improved attendance, participation and retention, and they're seen as very closely intertwined, as you'll see in some of the study findings. There are three kinds of levels of intervention. There's the target group. These would be children and young people with the greatest need who receive the most intensive supports. They're what are known as brief interventions, which are designed to help a student over a kind of crisis situation. So it's short-term support to deal with a crisis. And then there are some universal interventions, which can be whole class interventions, for example, around the transition to post-primary school. So there are in-school supports. There are supports around the school day, which would mean like breakfast, lunchtime, or after school. It also program also encompasses holiday provision and supports for young people who are actually out of school. And I'm going to say a bit more about those kinds of supports as we go on. Now, if we look first of all at cluster project grouping into clusters, we can see there's quite a variation in size of clusters, and over a fifth of projects have 9 or more schools. And we can see that on the whole, coordinators are fairly satisfied with how this grouping works, but we can see also that larger projects, these who have 9 or more schools, are more likely to say they're fairly satisfied rather than very satisfied, whereas smaller projects that would have typically 4 or fewer schools are more satisfied, are more likely to be very satisfied. Now, we probed behind that, and what we found were a number of issues. First of all, there was a concern among coordinators and project workers, as well as school staff, that sometimes there could be a lack of continuity over the transition between primary and post-primary if students were moving outside the project, and especially if they were transferring to a non-DEIS school outside the project. So one school staff member put this very well. They said, all this work and effort has been put on getting the children to school, getting them here on time, and then there's nobody to continue it once they start secondary school in September. Another issue came about around geographical spread. In some areas, particularly in rural areas, the schools in the project were quite remote from each other, so commuting time could cut into the time available for supports. There were also challenges among larger projects around logistics. So coordinators in larger projects tended to spend less time on face-to-face work with students and more time in administration. But these projects also had a higher ratio of students to staff, meaning that they had to cover relatively more students with a given staff complement. There was also some evidence of less contact between coordinators and schools personnel, especially principals and homeschool liaisons, where the project was larger and they were covering more schools. Now, how are they referred? How are they identified for this program and its supports? What we found is that identification is very much now a collaborative process. So it involves especially coordinators, homeschool coordinators, school principals, and the student support team in a school. That will be typically key personnel, including guidance counsellors at second level. So in this way, everybody is seen as having a responsibility and everybody goes away with tasks to complete. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a new intake framework, a more standardized intake framework, has been introduced since the last review of SCP. So 6 and 10 coordinators said they used it to a very great extent, with a further third using it somewhat. And in terms of their views, coordinators were kind of fairly evenly divided between finding it very useful and somewhat useful. And interestingly, those in larger projects tended to be more positive. The key positive features of the new approach to referral was really that it led to a clearer identification of need and allowed program supports to prioritise those with greatest need. One coordinator made the point that before the intake framework, many students were being sent for SEP support, but they could have been supported by school, and the most needy children were not being seen by SCP. Another coordinator said it informs the criteria for participation and ensures the selection process is equitable. But there were some challenges there around the process, or some issues that people raised. Firstly, the form was seen by some as long and somewhat burdensome. One EWO said they felt the form could be shortened. But probably a more important issue was that the process could be seen as a little bit intrusive by some parents who might be reluctant to disclose sensitive issues. So one school staff member said the perception of some parents of the HSCL is that we're checking up on them. So they'll be slow to give the information at times that will be really, really useful or really advantageous to their children, for fear it would look like a flaw on their behalf. Another said it can take months before a rapport is built with a parent to the point where they will be ready to accept help and sit down to complete a referral form. And this can then impinge, obviously, in the speed with which the children and young people can be engaged with. Now, as Sonia mentioned earlier, and has been given some attention in the coverage, one of the main issues, the main contextual changes, has been the issue of student need post-pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic era. We can see that coordinators generally felt, the majority of coordinators felt that attendance, engagement and well-being were worse or much worse than they had been before the pandemic. And this is backed up by Tusla statistics around the scale of student absence, of the proportion of students missing 20 or more days over a school year. Now, the consequences of this is really kind of around the needs of students and what needs are encountered within the programme as requiring support. So coordinators and staff pointed to a rise in mental health difficulties, especially anxiety, among students in the schools they worked with. One said there's a rise in anxiety levels and other mental health issues in the young people we work with post-pandemic due to lockdowns and lack of social engagement. Another staff member made the point that they were seeing these challenges at much younger ages now. Before, they'd only see it in teenagers. And linked to these issues of anxiety and mental health difficulties, they reported an increase in school avoidance and an early onset of patterns of absence. One staff member said, we're dealing with more young people who are completely refusing to go to school, whether it's due to anxiety, mental illness, or whatever the reason. But we're also dealing with more children who've been expelled or who are in long-term suspension. And it was felt that this vicious cycle of absence from school and disengagement can set in quite early and reinforce itself and lead to a vicious circle, a vicious cycle of non-attendance. One SEP staff member said, why would you want to come to school where you don't really know people and you can't keep up with the work and you feel you don't belong after a prolonged period of absence? Now, the staff, SEP staff and school staff in the case study areas that we looked at really provided a very vivid and stark picture of the scale and complexity of deprivation in local schools and communities. And they highlighted the way issues like food poverty and lack of money to meet educational costs like sports equipment can act as a barrier to attendance and full engagement in school. One school staff member said a lot of children will be coming from backgrounds where there might be drug abuse, there might be socioeconomic difficulties within the home, financial difficulties and family difficulties. The parents have maybe had a tough upbringing and then it continues. It seems difficult to break the cycle. It was clear too that it wasn't just the issue of individual family circumstances, but that the concentration of disadvantage in some local areas manifested itself in a kind of lack of facilities, a lack of resources to draw on from families. And in some cases, local conflict was spilling over into the schools. One staff member said this is an area where there will be extreme disadvantage. Drug addiction is massive. Open drug dealing is just commonplace. There was a feud there not so long ago, which had a huge impact on the school. At one point, we had to keep the gates closed. So all of this is impinging on students' ability to engage and attend school. Now, in terms of who takes part in the program or how many students it covers, typically the target group, that group of students with very intensive needs who require intensive supports, they would usually comprise 7 to 8% of the students within the project schools on average. But smaller projects were providing supports to a much larger proportion of their students, an average of a third. We see that those engaged in brief interventions is a smaller group again, by design really, because these are designed to be very temporary measures. So it's around 4% of students. Again, smaller projects tend to include more students. And brief interventions tend to be used more often for primary level students than at post-primary level. And we see that universal interventions, so these would be whole class supports around issues like the transition to second level, or it could be where an issue arose, say, racism and bullying in a school, and the school wanted to tackle it. So that would involve just under a fifth of students over the year. More commonly used again in primary school, and again, smaller projects tend to cover more of the students in the school. Now, in terms of what comprises the support within school completion, all of the projects provide in-school support for at least one school in their project. Almost all provide supports around the school day, so that's before, after school, or during lunchtime, during the holidays, and for those not in school. But the specific nature of the support provided varies between projects and across schools within projects, reflecting kind of need at local level. So the in-school supports that are most commonly provided are one-to-one and group work, personal development programs, transfer and transition programs to facilitate the transition to second level, and attendance tracking for the target group of young people. So what we see is, in terms of the approach used, that there's been an increase in the use of one-to-one intensive work since 2015. And staff put a lot of emphasis on the importance of these one-to-one supports in helping students engage with school, especially at post-primary level. One staff member said, I think the secondary schools need the one-to-ones. I don't think they'd share what they share with me if I had them in a big group. Another said, a lot of kids, they can't cope in the group, so the behaviour would just kick off and then they're excluded. Definitely for me, the one-to-ones are important. It's very important to the child that you're there to listen, you're there to support them, and they know when they come into school that support is there for them. However, staff were also positive about the role of group work and whole class work where appropriate. But sometimes there was a trade-off, if you like, with school principals perhaps wanting more universal programs and interventions, but kind of coordinators and staff had to manage that and say, well, that will take time away from one-to-one provision. So it's about balancing the needs of the target group with the greatest intensity of need and those broader classes that need support as well. Now, there were some challenges in kind of providing these in-school supports, mainly around timetable for withdrawal for one-to-one work. Now, in most cases, it was seen that teachers were often glad because the child goes back in feeling a bit better. They're not as disruptive, they're not as sad. But on from the point of view of the staff, they were concerned about disruption to the school day and someone being taken out of maths, for example. So it could only be for those who need intensive support. And this was a second level school. So it was seen as, you know, some challenges around, especially around exam year students. Now, in many of the projects, or many of the project schools, staff had access to designated spaces to work with students, but others felt, you know, constrained in terms of the facilities they had access to, and found themselves working from a hallway, a corridor, the corner of the staff room, the corner of the PE hall, which is not ideal. But almost by definition, one of the main challenges was around the lack of attendance of target students. Obviously, students are target students because they have a history of non-attendance, largely a chronic absenteeism. But there are difficulties in being flexible enough to rearrange a time slot if the student has a one-to-one session and they're not in the school on that day. Now, in terms of supports around the school day, these were more common in post-primary schools than in primary schools. So they comprise things like breakfast and after-school meal provision, study support, and some parental support. So Breakfast Club was seen as providing a great start to their day for students. That has been the difference for some children between coming to school and not coming to school sometimes. And it was felt that it helps with the transition into school. It's making school a happy place because if the students are happy, they're going to learn. But there were some challenges there too around the willingness to attend school outside of school hours, especially among the most vulnerable groups of students. And in rural areas, there could be issues around transport, as in school buses will leave and arrive at particular times, which may not facilitate participation in after-school activities. Holiday provision was provided in almost all projects, usually at summer or Easter, most commonly, with an average about 6 weeks of provision per year. These tended to focus on sports programs, trips, and other activities that could be seen as trying to enrich student experience. One project said they used to do in-house kind of things, but they didn't work. The kids were bored, so we started using the money to go on trips. The kids really look forward to it. When they come back off a trip, they're much more engaged with you. They're much more inclined to have the chats with you. So holiday provision was seen as important for a number of reasons. Mostly because it provided a broader life experience for those who may not go on holiday or take part in other structured activities during the holiday. It was also seen as important in helping students maintain a structure or routine in their day and help avoid them getting into potential trouble. But again, there could be some challenges there around trying to get that target group, the most disengaged students, to be involved. So staff were engaged in constant reminders and prompting to try and get kids to turn up. There could also be resource issues, as I'll talk about it later. If funds were constrained, it tended to be holiday provision that lost out, and the variety of holiday provision offered could depend very much on available funds. So finally, the other strand was out of school provision. So young people could be out of school because of school avoidance, because they've been suspended, expelled, or because they've dropped out of school altogether. Around half of the projects have at least one young person taking part in iSchool. That's an online or blended learning approach that provides a more structured learning for 13 to 16-year-olds. It was very much stressed by SCP staff that those who are out of school require really intensive support with home visits and follow-up. They say it requires huge time for one child. You could spend a whole week with one child trying to access services, trying to cajole them, trying to inform them, trying to get them to do something at home. And often this group of young people were facing very complex challenges, including mental health difficulties, which was, obviously challenging for the staff. One said, it's bigger than who we are. It requires psychologists, timely intervention from psychological services. And the more they've stayed at home, the worse they've gotten. A particular issue was the lack of options for alternative education in some areas, to refer students on after they've left mainstream education. This was especially the case for younger groups, for younger people who were not old enough to access programs like Youth Reach. Now, just to turn to kind of staffing, funding and governance, we can see that around half of coordinators were not satisfied with existing levels of staffing and funding. We have seen an increase in funding since 2019, which has been above the rate of inflation for 2020 to 22. But actually, the nominal level of funding is still below the 2008 level, while the number of schools covered has increased. It's worth saying that in the earlier review, school completion had experienced quite significant funding fall-offs in the wake of the austerity measures introduced during and after the recession. So it's recovered most of the ground, but not quite all. So one issue that was raised earlier was around governance arrangements and the variation in employment arrangements for coordinators and project workers. A key issue was really around dissatisfaction with staffing and funding, was about the level of staffing relative to student need. One person said, when you're only here 2 days a week, there are 3 days a week where those students are not being looked after. And they're the days when they get into trouble. An awful lot of kids do need the support, and there's lots that aren't being identified because we have such high needs in the project. And as a result, a lot of young people are falling through the cracks. They generally made the point that the vast majority of the budget goes on staffing. So that leaves less funding or little funding for activities or trips. One said our budget is really saturated by staff costs. Another said, I'd love it if staff were centrally employed like teachers, so we'd have a budget that's for activities and for administration. Looking at the perceived impact of school completion on student outcomes from the coordinator perspective, really they felt it had impacted to a great extent on the transition from primary to second level, on making school a positive experience for young people, a little bit more on junior cycle completion than senior cycle completion, and also on increasing attendance rates. When we talked to school principals and homeschool coordinators about their view of the programme, it was really positively regarded by these staff. Key elements were the provision of social and emotional support to help bridge the gap in life chances. One said children in the area will be lost without it. It's a huge support for families. Another described it as a positive experience for the kids, helping them to develop skills, being able to cope, and giving them a sense of value. What was really seen as central was the quality of relationships that staff could establish with students. So it provided them with a source of support and a reliable figure to listen to them. One said the consistency of contact is massive. There are children who don't have stability in their lives. That's an asset to the children because that person is there Monday to Friday. These are children that have their voice listened to through school completion. Their concerns are validated, which they might not always be in their home or in the class. They're minded and looked after, and that trust is built up. The skills and commitment of staff was seen as key in this respect. They were described as going above and beyond, and the kids loving them. and providing a different relationship with the teacher. So sometimes students would say, I came to school today because they were seeing the project worker. It was also seen as having the potential to respond and flexibility to respond to emerging needs. Even though there are national guidelines, we have the flexibility to respond to the needs of the child, the school, the community. And having the flexibility to do a quick referral for a child that needs a short, quick intervention, that's been very useful to maybe prevent something that could become this huge problem. So just to conclude and talk a little bit about the implications of the study findings for policy and practice. So what I've tried to show is that the study findings show the value of SEP in providing targeted and responsive provision to vulnerable children and young people. And its success really rests on the skills and commitment of staff who provide a trusted adult who offers support and advocate often for those students. It's seen positively by principals and homeschools who see it as making school a more positive place for children and young people, and thus enhancing their attendance and retention. It's also seen as playing an important role in enhancing the transition from primary to post-primary. And staff also play an important role in trying to mobilise other resources to address barriers to participation, linking to food banks, getting sponsorship to cover education costs and cover a holiday provision, and so on. But there are aspects of the programme that could be further enhanced. As I mentioned, there are a variety of employment arrangements with perceived job insecurity and lack of pension arrangements seen as impacting on staff turnover, though the Department of Education is currently working on this issue. There can be a kind of a trade-off between flexibility and inconsistency, and there does seem to be scope for greater contact between projects to build a common vision and to feed back some of the retention planning information that projects provide so that they know what's going on in other projects. There's a case too for looking at project boundaries, given the challenges for larger projects and issues around kids moving out of project areas. We've seen a growing incidence of school avoidance and the need, therefore, to kind of invest in more resources for out-of-school supports. We see too that funding has been absorbed by staff costs and it's still not at 2008 levels, and there might be a case for ring-fenced funding for activities. Now, it's important to kind of place the programme within its broader context. It's part of a suite of DEIS supports. We see a strong collaborative relationship with principals, homeschools and education welfare officers, but there's probably potential for greater involvement of coordinators in formal DEIS planning to ensure that there's a more holistic service to students. The staff are often well linked to local organisations and agencies, but there is no ready access to referral pathways for children and young people with more complex needs because of waiting lists elsewhere. So we're seeing a kind of mismatch between this growing need of anxiety and school avoidance and available services, which are going to impact on attendance and participation without additional resources. There are a number of barriers to educational participation. There's been an improvement in terms of school books, free school books, and the rollout of breakfast provision. But deprivation levels and cost of living have had their impact on families, and there are challenges around meeting educational costs such as uniforms, sports equipment, and transition year activities. And again, it kind of reinforces the case that's been made by ESRI colleagues for a second-tier child benefit payment for many of the SEP families would fit into this category. And obviously schools can't do everything. There is a need for these school-based initiatives to be underpinned by broader supports for families at local level, particularly around mental health and other supports for parents, but also community development initiatives at local level. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there. You will have an opportunity to put questions in online later on, and I'll stop sharing.
Great, thanks so much, Emer. Fascinating as ever. As you say, actually, if people want to start thinking about questions, just enter them into the Q&A function, and towards the end of the webinar, we'll try and put some of those questions to Emer and America. But before we get to the Q&A, delighted to say that we have Sheena O'Loughlin from the Social Inclusion Unit in the Department of Education with us. Listening to Emer, there's certainly a lot of food for thought there, Sheena. So we look forward to hearing your reflections.
Absolutely, Alan. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Emer, for that very informative presentation. And it would be remiss of me not to mention Garange and Marika for their work on this study, and to Anya and the TESS team who commissioned this report and obviously supported the coordination of the report. Also to thank everyone who's attended today, because it's very important that we have people to listen to the findings, and also to everyone who provided information as part of this study. And this has allowed for key insights to be captured, obviously, and reported on. And it shows how SDP has evolved since the 2015 report. Obviously, the programme has seen many changes since then, and I suppose the key change that has impacted the Department of Education is the transfer of the programme back to ourselves from January 2021. And it comes under the responsibility of Social Inclusion Unit within the department, and I'm very delighted to be here today to represent this section. The publication and the launch of this report today, it's very welcomed, obviously, and it provides a lot of information and findings, and also recommendations and areas for further development, which the department will consider. The findings are overwhelmingly positive, and it restates the value that SCP provides to very vulnerable children and young people at risk of educational disadvantage. Obviously, when we're thinking about school attendance, regular school attendance is very important for the child's development and their academic achievement, but also for their wider social development. And when we look at the attendance data, obviously there's a report of an increase in absenteeism in both primary and post-primary schools. And unfortunately, this is higher in schools in more disadvantaged areas. And these increases post-pandemic, you know, in mental health issues, obviously, and anxiety, as Emer had referenced, among the children and young people, also impacts on the school attendance. You know, we know students miss schools for a variety of reasons, and missing a day or so every month doesn't seem like a big deal, but obviously this adds up to, you know, a child being chronically absent, and then this makes students miss learning opportunities and valuable experiences that they have in school, and this impacts then also on the school's ability to deliver interventions that will improve student outcomes and educational outcomes. I suppose when we look at SCP and the supports that the programme provides, you know, it's key that the support that they provide, you know, before the school day, during the school day, around the school day, in the holiday periods, and obviously then provision that they provide for children that are out of school. And that's the key strength of this programme. There is that wraparound service of the programme. And the SCP staff and the programme itself obviously do act regularly as an advocate for these children and to help them break down their barriers and the full participation in education. There was a recent OECD peer learning event that I was delighted to take part in, and there was an excellent presentation. I won't name them today, from an SCP project. And our fondness of the Irish to offer a cup of tea as a welcome was mentioned and explained to our European counterparts. So even that simplest act of, you know, the cup of tea works towards breaking down barriers. It makes children feel very comfortable and safe and supported and listened to. There's an old Irish proverb, and it says "Mull an oiga agus chucky sheed," and it's praise the young and they will flourish. So that nearly encapsulates the work that SCP workers do on the ground. Highlighted also is the work that the schools do alongside the work of the SCP and the importance of them working together. And I've been out visiting SCP projects, and I've seen firsthand how well this works when the school and the SCP staff collaborate together and what can be achieved under this approach. So I think that's a key thing to mention, the support that schools give to the SCP workers and the programme. So Emer has obviously run through many of the significant improvements that have been made to address the recommendations of the 2015 report. And I won't run through them again, but I suppose 10 years on from the initial review, it's evident that the programme has changed and adapted their approaches to embrace our changing landscape and our level of need. I suppose to mention particularly, I suppose, the implementation of strengthened policies and procedures and the rollout of CPD for staff and additional support for the LMCs has made significant improvement to the support that's provided for those roles and the staff within that programme. Also increases in SCP funding since 2021, since it came under the responsibility of the department. All that is worked towards addressing the growing needs of the individual projects. Obviously, while there are many findings in the ESRI report published, it also highlights a number of areas that there is room for further development. And it's important to note that the SCP projects have expanded in recent years with the expansion of DEIS and their newly designated DEIS schools. And the findings indicate that this has presented obviously some challenges, particularly for those larger projects. Findings also highlight that funding levels and variation between the projects and the cluster arrangements can impact on the rollout of services within individual projects. And also as echoed in this report and also previous reports and consultations, a more clear and consistent governance and employment model is required across the projects. And this will address help to address some of the weaknesses in the current governance arrangements. Obviously, the department worked very closely with TESS on this work and in addressing attendance and avoidance at school level. And obviously, our aim with looking at this work is to address many of the areas highlighted for improvement and for further development as part of this report today. When we're talking about the funding, since the department took over responsibility for the programme, as part of budgetary measures, the SCP has seen an annual increase in funding, and the total allocation for the programme for 2025 is just under 36 million. So it's quite significant funding. It represents just under 20% of the overall DEIS funding. So additional funding from 2023 has also allowed for the realignment of SCP workers to their appropriate pay scales and to keep on par with the public sector pay increases. So all of these budget measures, demonstrates the department's commitment to continue considering this programme, funding this programme, and also to ensure that the ongoing needs of the children and the young people within that participate in this programme are met. When we're talking about the governance structures, and it was highlighted as part of this report, there's a programme of work currently underway to develop a new employment framework for SCP workers. So we've had consultations over the last year with many of the coordinators and members of the local management committees, and gathered initial scoping, and obviously agreement has been reached that going forward that a new employment framework is more robust and sustainable and governed, and supports obviously the further development of this programme also. So the work over the coming months will include looking at the roles and responsibilities and the functions of all the participating organisations, and also it'll work to develop their organisational processes and the procedures that will be required to support these new roles. Obviously, as part of this work, we will consider the cluster arrangements and also the project boundaries and the funding model for this programme. Emma mentioned how SCP is embedded in the school for DEIS planning. So there is work that can be done in that space to ensure that SCP is further embedded in the DEIS planning. Obviously, we will work with the department's inspectorate and stakeholders on this. And I suppose it's worth mentioning that all this work relies heavily on stakeholder engagement, and that will be carried out over the coming months to advance the programme of work. Emma referenced also school avoidance, and obviously the growing instance of school avoidance is something that the department are very aware of and are very keen to address. And particularly when you talk about the one-to-one support that is required to meet the needs of children and young people who are out of school for various reasons. So there is an action in the new programme for government to implement a range of actions and recommendations from the report of the review of the out-of-school education provision. This report was published in May 22. And on foot of this report, there are 6 key recommendations to inform future policy. and to support the implementation of actions under this policy, an implementation group was established in October 22, and they will work towards developing a standardised framework for short-term and both long-term out-of-school provision. This group has actually completed the work, and the report is currently being finalised, and it's hoped that this report will be presented to Minister McEntee shortly. So along with this, to accompany this report, there will be also a 5-year action plan, and it's currently in development stages, and it's to implement the recommendations of this report. When we're considering the broader policy in relation to, I suppose Emma referenced the cost of education and how it impacts on attendance and obviously child well-being and poverty. The implications for the broader policy relating to this are also being addressed and worked on by the department as part of a whole of government approach. So we continue to work with the Child Poverty and the Wellbeing Programme Office to implement actions that will aim to reduce child poverty and foster children's wellbeing. So there have been many supports rolled out under the department to address these issues. So just to give you a sample, a flavour of some of the supports that are rolled out. So some of these include, as Emma referenced, the implementation of the school book scheme. We also work closely with the Department of Social Protection on the rollout and extension of the school meals programme, the extension of the Strand 1 of the counselling pilot into further schools in the Dublin region. The new Traveller and Roma Education Strategy, TESS, was launched in July 2024, and there are a number of actions under that policy to support Traveller and Roma children in education. One of these actions includes the establishment of 15 community link worker posts, which will work to further support Traveller and Roma children and those most at risk of educational disadvantage. Alongside this, 10 additional HSCL posts that were established in 2022 will continue to support 14 schools, non-DEIS schools with high numbers of Traveller and Roma children. So these are just a flavour of the new measures that ensure this continued focus of the department on the well-being of children and young people at risk of educational disadvantage. So what the role, obviously, and it's evident today and it's been reiterated today, the role of SCP is a vital component of TESS integrated support service and the service for schools and students. And it includes the HSCL, the student support teams, the education and welfare service, and obviously the wider youth services and community links. So in her first all speech as Minister for Education, Minister McEntee has outlined her commitment to tackle the the attendance levels and the absenteeism levels. And this is consideration of the levels in both DEIS and non-DEIS schools. And the Minister is also obviously focused on ensuring that there's a continued focus on tackling educational disadvantage in schools. So work that's ongoing and work that will be developed over the coming months is plans to enhance the existing DEIS programme. So that's to ensure that supports children and young people with the highest level of disadvantage. So based on the needs of these children in the schools with the highest level of disadvantage, they will receive an enhanced package of support to meet their needs. So while the range of these supports is still being finalised, enhanced funding and staffing supports and priority access to wellbeing supports are being considered. Obviously, alongside we're providing targeted supports on numeracy and literacy. The OECD review in 2024 also looked at Ireland's current approach to resourcing schools to address educational disadvantage. And the findings of this review, along with our consultations with stakeholders, will assist to inform the development of the new DEIS plan, which is expected to be finalised in 2025. To assist with this work, the department has also established an interdepartmental group to address educational disadvantage, which is a key group. This group is a whole of government approach to consider how best we use our resources and obviously other government resources and relevant community and voluntary resources into that collaborative response. Obviously, Emma referenced, you know, the work of the Department of Social Welfare in relation to funding for school uniforms and child benefit that goes towards the cost of providing for children. So this group will look at how best we utilise these services and have an integrated approach. So obviously the development of a new DEIS plan will focus on developing, you know, more innovative approaches and work towards that more flexible system of supports that will ensure that a school can respond and receive the right support at the right time. So that's all from me, and thanks for your time today. And obviously we value the commitment and the dedication of the SB staff, and we look forward to advancing the work outlined and with you all as key stakeholders. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sheena. Appreciated those thoughts. So I'm going to ask Emer and Marika to join us, and as we noted previously, if people want to enter questions on the Q&A function, we'll address those to Emer and Marika. So before we get into that, actually, Emer, I mean, just and Marika, a thought just struck me, and I don't know if you can answer it. So there's clearly a lot of sort of positive ingredients in this program. But I'm just wondering, I'm sort of conscious from other areas I'm working on, is that we have some very, very good programs, but they're not covering enough people. Our access to the you know, the program is often not as strong as we would like. Is this an issue here? Are there a group of kids who could really benefit from this, who are missing out?
From the visits to the different schools during the data gathering process, quite a few principals said that they would like to extend the school completion program to more children in their school. And they saw that many kids were borderline in terms of quite likely to slip into issues and non-attendance, etc. And with a little bit of boost, they would be supported and encouraged. But often, you know, they are not really in a position to do that. So there definitely is appetite for maybe extending the provision.
Okay, I mean, it's a dilemma in any program, and sort of fully understand that. But I think it's one of these things we know that typically the return on the investment of programs like this is absolutely enormous. You know, in the sense that if you can have the positive impacts for relatively low cost in the grand scheme of things, the difference is huge. But look, I could ask questions, and I might return to a couple of others, because it's all fascinating, and because this is not my area of expertise, things strike me. But let's go to some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience. So first to Anne-Marie McGarren. So Anne-Marie begins with a note of thanks, but which is important, and then we get on to the question. So Anne-Marie is wondering about outcomes for children in smaller versus larger projects. Is it possible to say anything in these? And then also, can you tell if there's any difference in school avoidance stroke attendance in single-sex versus mixed-sex schools? So difference in outcomes across larger and smaller, so yeah, smaller and larger projects, and single-sex versus mixed schools. So again, Marika, Emer, I don't know which one of you would prefer.
I might jump in there. I mean, being honest, one of the gaps in what we know is about objective outcomes for the children and young people in SCP. We have information on perceived outcomes from the point of view of SCP staff and school staff, and they are very positive. The challenge is separating out the effects of SCP from other parts of the DEIS system. So students are getting multiple supports from different sources. So that hasn't been well disentangled in previous work, but I think there is a potential, especially now that there's more evidence-based programs being used as part of SCP. They often have a way of evaluating, you know, progress within those. Hubble have developed for adults, albeit a distant travel tool, which kind of looks at soft skill development, which I think is a really important thing here. So there's very much that potential to kind of put in place measures to kind of capture outcomes and progress. On the single-sex co-ed, we don't know yet we're pleased to kind of say that we're embarked on a new program of research with Tusla Education Support Service, and part of that will be using data like growing up in Ireland to look at changes pre and post pandemic in the profile of students whose attendance has fallen off, but also to better exploit the administrative data that are collected and to kind of provide a way of using them for tracking in a more proactive way. I hope I haven't misrepresented anything on you.
So question from Sandra Ryan, and again, it's related to outcomes. So the answer to this may be related to the answer to the previous one, but again, begin with some congratulations, and then great to see that SCP is positively perceived generally, and your report outlines perceived positive outcomes for target students. Is there any data available or being tracked on the actual outcomes for SCP target participants in relation to progression in education and achieving potential? Also concerning to see increased numbers of school suspensions. Do you have more details of how SCP program staff engage with those students? So the two strands there, I mean, the tracking over time in terms of outcomes, and then the specific question on school suspensions.
I might come in, Emer, is that helpful?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think just to say a couple of things, Emer's already alluded to it, that we have commissioned further research and work with ESRI over the coming period and over the remainder of the lifetime of our school attendance improvement plan as the wider TESS. So one of the pieces that will maybe deal with a question further down the list is that we are over the coming 12 months looking and working with ESRI to understand our data better, to think about, are we collecting the right data? How do we I suppose develop a data collection strategy, a data strategy, and then think about the systems that we have available to us to collect that data. And some of that will be in relation to having up to date, as close as we can get to real-time attendance data, as well as thinking about what data we need to start to systematically and comprehensively collect from SCP and homeschool to tell I suppose the story more broadly about the TESS intervention, along with the other DEIS supports and school supports at that level, and understand it. The second piece that we've, I suppose, commissioned, working with Emer and Mirka, is accessing that rich knowledge and growing up in Ireland. We are really keen to begin to interrogate how school attendance impacts and what we can learn from that about the interventions that we provide. So it is tough when you contribute to successfully supporting children to stay in school, like a program like School Completion. But we are, I believe, engaging with the right people as researchers to help us interrogate that and understand that better. And I suppose that's my commitment as director. I keep talking to the team about we want to own our expertise, and that includes your expertise in SCP as part of TESS. We are providing great interventions, and what we want to always, I suppose, be in a position to do is to have the data that says, do more of this, do less of that. And today's report is, while not a data, hard numbers driven report, it's a real insight into what's working really, really well and what we need to build on. So I just wanted to kind of mention those few things.
Yeah, no, very helpful. Emer, America, did you want to come in further?
Just maybe on the school suspension issue that Sandra raised. Yes, definitely project workers and coordinators are kind of supporting students going through that kind of suspension, expulsion phase, and often acting as advocates for them and their parents in the whole process. We probably can't get more specific than that, but I think it's also important to remember from other work we've done on early school leaving and youth reach participants that often it's not a formal expulsion that, you know, young people can be sort of managed out at the school level, and that they're not necessarily picked up, especially if they're beyond, you know, the age of school leaving.
Perhaps one more thing, in some cases when the student hasn't really been to school for quite a period of time, maybe not necessary to do expulsions, but the project workers are working quite closely together with the Home-School-Liaison officers in schools, and that seems to work quite well as well.
Anya,
To kind of to have the bridge.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, I did also just want to flag that we are at an advanced stage of reviewing the 2008 Code of Behaviour guidelines that schools must adhere to in terms of developing their own Code of Behaviour. And I suppose with reference to the query on suspension, when over the next 18 months, we're working across all near 4,000 schools in terms of rolling out the new revised Code of Behaviour. There will be, I suppose, such a focus for all of us around the school community, working with school leadership to look at what does the code tell us in terms of developing that school culture and climate, explaining the expectations of everybody in the school so that the students understand, what needs to happen day to day, and hopefully, I suppose that the purpose of that and the successful outcome of the use of the Code of Behaviour will be to significantly reduce, and I suppose ultimately the goal is to eliminate suspension and expulsion, and that we figure out that way of all of us being together in school and getting on well. So we're really excited in TESS, working with our colleagues in NCSE to get out on the road in the coming period with the new Code of Behaviour. And with the just recently published last Friday launched Relate document from colleagues in the NCSE. So we're going to see a lot of us out engaging with everyone in the system, and again, school completion in terms of that relationship, that key relationship they hold with some of our really vulnerable learners, will be a big part of supporting that school culture and climate thinking that needs to go on in terms of the new code in the coming months. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Anya. So we've got a question from McFinn, and it kind of builds on the question that I posed at the outset. So my question would be around this sort of question about whether or not there were kids who could benefit from the program who weren't, where the funding hadn't been extended to them. America answered the question, I think, from a sort of within school perspective, but Mick is raising the interesting question where he says there are DEIS type students in all schools who need the support. Yeah. I think it's an interesting one. Sheena, would you like to make a comment on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Obviously, it is recognised that there are children in non-DEIS schools that there's a certain level of disadvantage and at risk of educational disadvantage. And there are supports within schools, non-DEIS schools, to support students. But obviously the OECD review that I referenced in my points, while it looked at the DEIS programme, it also looked at the wider range of supports and resources that were available in non-DEIS schools. So out of that report, there are 17 recommendations, which looks at resourcing schools to tackle educational disadvantage in all schools, both DEIS and non-DEIS. So the work that is ongoing and will be advanced over the next coming months, as stated by Minister McEntee, will look at these recommendations and also will involve that consultation piece and engagement. And alongside the development of the DEIS plan and enhanced supports for those schools at highest levels of disadvantage, there will be consideration given to the level of resources that is required in the non-DEIS schools to ensure that needs of children that are at an educational disadvantage in those schools is met.
Great, thanks for that. Sheena, I'm reading questions while listening to answers, which is never a great idea. Let me do my best to carry on. James Kavanagh makes the point, it's about the likely cost saving to the state in the long term from the investment in SCP. So I think, again, that's a point we're generally agreed on, that these can be tremendously valuable interventions at a cost that is not outrageous. Going to read out a question from Anne Davies, and again, anybody on the panel can try and answer. So I'll just read out. Do the panel see the benefits of SCP capacity to play a long-term sustainable role in the rollout of enhanced in-school therapy supports currently at pilot level? Our SCP work is mentor-based and we respond to all issues arising, many that lay the groundwork for students' engagement in many therapies and follow on maintenance work after the therapeutic work, stroke strategy and other voluntary work has finished. So would any of you, Anya, yeah, you're delighted to see you coming in again, so.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a really important question. So thank you for that. As you know, and I've probably said this on many occasions, SCP coordinators and project workers do not provide, or the role is not there to provide therapeutic interventions. But we all know that we have identified over the last long number of years the need for those therapeutic supports. And I think we're all delighted to see the rollout of the pilots that are happening across the system in terms of putting those therapeutic supports into schools. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of the role that School Completion Programme will play in providing the interventions that school completion is so good at in terms of social and emotional connection to school, being ready to be in the classroom learning, and also connecting to NEPS colleagues and to those therapeutic supports in school in ensuring that the right children are prioritised to access those therapeutic supports. So again, I suppose from my perspective at school level, we have the school principal and school leadership team, the classroom teacher, and then the rest of us, SCP, Homeschool, EWO, NEPS, NCSE, all as required, depending on the presenting need, are wrapping around. And I suppose very excitingly, with youth coming into the department or in the department now, looking at what is that wraparound that goes morning, through the school day, early after school, into the evening, into the night time for some young people, and around the weekend in terms of that wraparound piece. So absolutely, while SCP is not a therapeutic intervention, it is, of course, a key component in wrapping around the therapeutic offer as part of that overall wraparound in school.
Great, thanks for that. So another question, unfortunately, we're coming close now to our timeline, but I did want to get the next question in. So did the ESRI research look at the correlation between phone screen time and the increase in absenteeism? There's a cohort of children in school who have had phone screen time since they were 6 months old. And generally the question, I suppose, is asking that we're certainly observing this increase in absenteeism. It seems to be that, the blame in a sense is put on COVID, but do we fully understand this increase in absenteeism and school avoidance? Is it all related to COVID, or are there other, screen time is obviously one issue that is put, but I think we probably also referenced to a study recently that parents working from home seems to be having a role here as well, that there's a sort of a strange dynamic, in households of people not going out in that sort of old-fashioned way. So again, Emer, in America, I don't know, any sort of thoughts or reflections?
I guess we don't know definitively, and we are doing work based on growing up in Ireland that will provide more insights into that. I think it's probably more complex than saying it's screen time, though. The timing of the increase was very much driven by the post-pandemic period. We would have expected an increase before the pandemic if it was just screens and mobile phone diffusion. So I think it is more complex. I think we need to look at that. We need to look at the increase in mental health difficulties that we're seeing from at school level, but we're seeing in growing up in Ireland data. There are other complexities around family challenges and so on. So I think we need to unpack that. Screens might be part of the issue, but I don't think they're responsible for that big dramatic increase that we saw from 21, 22, 23.
Great, thanks for that. Look, really sorry to say this, there are more questions, but unfortunately we've hit our timeline. So I do want to bring things to a close. So I want to thank Anya and Gina for coming along and contributing as you've done. As we always say in the Institute, I mean, you know, we're always obviously interested in the research findings, but the policy implications really matter to us. And this is one of these occasions where I think there's sort of policy challenges posed to both of you and your respective organizations. So it'll be interesting over time to follow up and carry on with the discussion. Thanks all. So obviously, and congratulations to Emer and America, and indeed to Grant for great presentations and engagement today, and for a fantastic report. So with that, going to draw things to a close. Thank everybody for showing up today online, and hopefully we'll talk to you all again before too long. So bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.